everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 2, Top Down. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan Ahn. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason.
Hello.
Happy to have both of you on the air again. My first question is, what did you think was missing from this chapter?
Well, I think maybe for the first time, I have a lot on this chapter, and so we might stick with this question for a little bit. Looking at the start, really minor point, but in the footnote of the first page, you talk about Chanayu. And so you obviously say within the footnote that discussing Chanayu at length is out of the scope of the chapter. But I did really notice one strong omission to me as far as Chanayo and how it was shaped within your footnote. So you left out Saicho and Kukai, two famous monks who contribute to the early development of the presence of tea. I wouldn't really say a tea practice, but the presence of tea and Buddhism in Japan. Was there a reason that you left out those two monks?
That's a great question. I think one of the problems in discussing either Chinese tea ceremony or Japanese tea ceremony is individuals tend to subscribe to the great man theory of history. They tend to subscribe to the idea that it is a singular creation that was instituted by someone who can be understood and who could be revered and who can be studied. But in reality, right, many of the innovations, many of the conversations, many of the implementations were actually driven by a variety of forces and a number of individual practitioners. So Lu Yu in Chinese tea ceremony gets the majority of the credit, even though Lu Yu is adopting and adapting older practices and helping to spread practices to other practitioners who had similar levels of influence on creating and spreading the praxis, particularly as Lu Yu was a well-known hermit. In Japanese tea ceremony, right, I would say fewer people have ever heard of Takenju versus Senrukyo, but Senrukyo tends to get all the credit, right? And Takenju, in addition to Senrukyo, had other students that Senrukyo was colleagues with, who get very little credit. So it is very difficult, even in writing a book such as this, to break out of that great man mold of history and to give credit to all of the various practitioners and all of the various individuals that made a mark, particularly when only lightly touching on a topic as a cursory overview. So no particular reason, but.
Yeah, I think that answer satisfies me. I think my real main call out on Saicho and Kukai, right, the two of them, I think it's mostly Saicho, being the founder of Tendai Buddhism. We're bringing that back to Japan, which is the form of Buddhism, right, that Eisai studies, and then he goes to China, right, brings tea more so as we know it from Song Dynasty China back, as well as Rinzai Buddhism. So I think it's that link of Tendai Buddhism between Saicho to Eisai that I find interesting, and maybe was something I was looking for. But certainly I agree, right? There's many practitioners around, and you can't really give them all their due credit, especially in a footnote. But that was one part that I had seen. And I think another part that I felt was missing is in some of the later parts of the chapters. So later on in the chapter, there's a few other places where I feel like there was some content or maybe just an explanation missing. You talk of schools, tests, and competitions as forms of top-down ways to institutionally drive a praxis forward. I felt that when you talked about tests and competitions specifically, there's a lot of reference to other, beverage traditions, coffee and wine specifically. But within tea, there is competitions, there are tests, When we think of tea certifications, there's groups like World Tea Academy or Specialty Tea Institute, et cetera, that provide some form of testing and practice. And then there's things like the Global Tea Championship. I was wondering what you were thinking when you decided to leave these out, or was it a purposeful decision, or did you feel that the other beverage traditions had a better established form of tests and competition, and that's why you chose to present those?
I would certainly say that the other traditions have more established and more impactful competitions than tea does. World Barista Championship has hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars of funding and implementations and ramifications. The licensing in wine is much more well established than any of the licensing in tea. But part of the problem, I think, in tea is that the sourcing, right, and trustable sourcing, and the levels of sourcing that's required, the levels and the amount of tea that's required to actually make a commercial impact makes it much more complicated than coffee or wine. Certainly, high-end coffee and wine is made in limited amounts and limited production volumes, but both coffee and wine are economies of scale, where it's easier to produce high quality at higher volumes, right? Tea is absolutely not an economy of scale, right? There is no marginal cost benefit of producing more tea. Your costs scale linearly with the amount of tea that you're producing because of the artisan labor, the lack of mechanization for high-end tea and high-end processing. So because of that, the types of teas that you see in competition, outside of the farmer competitions, right? I would say that the Lugu Dongding, Lugu Farmers Association competition is a great example of competition working very well in tea. But practitioner competitions, if someone has a tea that is much better than another person, right? At some level, it doesn't matter how good the skills of the practitioners are. And because the majority of those competitions and other traditions are driven by merchants, right? The idea of reflective glory, of creating trusted individuals or trusted sources within the tea world, the levels of tea quality that we see in there is not what many practitioners of higher levels are interested in or looking for. And that would be a topic that I would be happy to debate. I do think that there is room for competition in tea, and I write as much in the chapter, but I don't think any of the current competitions meet that goal.
Is it that they don't meet that goal, or do you feel that they don't really fall within the lens or scope of our tradition as well? That is to say, do you think the types of tea competitions, I think one example I gave, right, was the Global Tea Championship. Do you think what they're showcasing, what they're being judged on, the value that's being placed on their performance, do you think that it is in any way in line with what we value as a practice, so the literati tradition and the scope of focus that we have, or do you find that they're completely different?
It's hard to say. So like when you look at the type of ceremony that we think of, so this literati tradition, breaking it down into levels of practice, and most of the competitions do try to incorporate some levels of utility, structural functionalism, and showmanship, or you could argue is phenomenology, but it's much more objective. If you watch any of the World Barista Champion competitions, it's kind of ridiculous. You have three people surrounding the brewer, looking at everything from how they tamp the coffee to making sure they don't have any coffee grounds spilled everywhere. And they've created this somewhat ridiculous grading system and have totally objectified that process and quantified it in a way that it's much harder to pin down in tea. It would probably feel pretty arbitrary though.
In between the literati tradition as it exists today which is moving off of, late Ming, early Qing ideals, right? And trying to compare that to competition as events, competition as spectacle. And you look back at the critiques that were leveled contemporaneously in the Song dynasty and into the Tang dynasty on Diancha, where Diancha started as a way of individuals showcasing unique techniques and skills and good sourcing capabilities and good preparation technique. And it gets more and more over the top, right? It becomes more and more of a spectacle than it does a viable competition focused on the tea itself. And you have individuals that begin to move away from Dian Cha and say that, Dian Cha is not in line with the original practice of tea, and we've moved away from Lu Yu's conception of Cha Jing and the wandering mendicants of China and the ideals of tea as medicine, and you have this whole pushback on Dian Cha, and you actually have, to an extent, the rise of Ten Cha and loose leaf tea contemporaneously with it, and it got less attention, right? It was less written about, but it was very prevalent. It was very findable during that time. And you also, at the same time, had a third school of the tea in the Buddhist monasteries that took some things from court ceremonies and took some things from pointing tea and took some things from earlier Buddhist works and combined that into their own methodology, which was also not totally removed from spectacle. The large mass tea gatherings in Song Dynasty monasteries, right, had a bunch of the Buddhist chantings and circumnavigating the halls. So I think that a lot of the critique that we are giving here is reflective and parallel to the critiques that were leveled against Dian Cha contemporaneously, in that in order to make it enough of a spectator sport, in order to make it enough of a visible, interpretable, understandable competition, there has to be these arbitrary decisions made. And it becomes very difficult for good technique rising to the top depends on good criteria of evaluation, right? A good rubric. And whoever is in charge of that rubric would also need to be at the top level of skills and practice in order to interpret and understand and judge, right, the technique of others. So I'm not sure that that's what we're seeing in the current competition, right? There is an alternative coffee competition where every individual is given the same blind coffee. They're given, I don't know exactly what it is, maybe it was 100 grams or 150 grams, and they're given, 1 hour to experiment with the grinds and come up with a recipe and a brewing technique. And then everyone brews in series, and whoever brews that coffee best wins. Perhaps something like that could work in tea. Perhaps everyone gets the same tea and is allowed to use, right, whatever brewing technique they want. And then they're judged based on the flavor profile. Perhaps that would be a more fair evaluation. But even then, you still get questions, right? Is someone allowed to use a Qing Dynasty Yixing? Is someone allowed to use Dehua libation cups, right? Or is there a standard set and they have to brew within the standard set? I think a Ping Bei competition would be pretty boring, or not. I could be proven wrong.
So yeah, I definitely would agree. I think, a competition where you're truly being judged, right, on maybe not pre-practiced skills, but being able to interpret the people you're going to be performing for, right, judges as well as spectators, but also the product that you're given, right, tea, and the wares available to you. I think in a competition like the one you propose, right, would be a way to really showcase your skill as an individual that you're bringing to the table, and not the wares you're bringing or not the tea you're bringing. So something like that could truly be interesting, and it'd be interesting to see if we see a development like that in tea in the future.
At a practitioner level, so like competitions like the Lugu Farmer Association make a lot of sense because there's an economic incentive to winning. And if you look at practitioner level competitions like in wine or in coffee, there's also an economic incentive. If you become the world barista champion, right, you have this huge platform and people have built very successful careers in the tailwinds of that success. And you see the same case in wine, right? Like if you become an advanced level master sommelier or a master sommelier, at the highest level, right, you'll become wine director at some really nice restaurant, or maybe even start your own bottle shop. And it also gives you this great platform. But in tea, it's entirely unclear what that accreditation gives you. Like if I'm a certified, tea specialist by institution X, Y, or Z, what does that do for me from a career standpoint? What's the incentive? Because I think a lot of the programs that we see and a lot of the competitions that we see, from an industry perspective, it's unclear what that does for you. Pat, you work in industry. How does the industry view those types of competitions or levels of achievement?
Yeah, I would say from an industry view, the accreditations, right, are not really, I would say that they're not given a ton of value. It's probably different company to company. I've certainly been told, by some of my leadership, if I want to take these programs, I can, and they would, fund them. But at the same time, I make presentations at work. I talk to people about tea all the time. I think they're aware of my level of knowledge. It's not something they were looking for from me when I entered this role. They just saw, the background I have. They were able to talk to me. I could talk to my experience. I think that was more important to them than seeing, a piece of paper from XYZ institution, right? There are other people I do work with directly that do have some accreditations from some of the most, well-known tea-related institutions. I think they're very knowledgeable individuals as far as tea goes, and I totally respect them in their practice. I wouldn't say that they learned anything very different from what we propagated in our time at the Institute. I would just say that they paid more for it, and they have a piece of paper from, a recognized institution saying that they achieved this level of knowledge, right, or that they studied the materials well enough to pass the test. So, it's I would say, at least from my view in the industry, they're not required. They don't have a lot of value put upon them at this moment. And equally, I would say that outside of industry, you don't see a lot of hobbyists really going for them either. Maybe a couple of bloggers here and there, maybe looking to set a degree of trustworthiness or respectability for their level of knowledge. But you're not seeing a lot of hobbyists get these certifications or enter these institutions as well.
That leads me to my next question. Between these three methods described in this chapter, the three top-down methods, schools, tests, and competitions, which one do you see is the most likely to yield, to propagate and progress the practice of Chinese tea as it exists today?
I think tests are what's most needed in the immediate future, because there needs to be some cohesion across people, even with different interests, where we all share a similar set of facts and are drawing information from similar foundations. And it's the one really nice thing about tests. Like if you look at chemistry, right, this introductory chemistry, and that's that. Everyone learns the same thing. So same thing for tea. I think is what's most needed. You see a lot of merchants trying to be engaged in some level of education, and every once in a while, you'll see a very bold merchant say, there's this foundational myth that everyone has wrong, and because they have it wrong, it makes them make the wrong assumptions here, and here. And it's quite provocative, and it's quite fun to read through those comment threads. But just agreeing on the same basics is something that I think would benefit everyone.
And I'll take a turn at that as well. I think that similarly to Ryan, tests are definitely the first step, and tests are something individuals, right, can choose to do for themselves as a means of furthering their education. I think that competitions, if structured correctly, and kind of similar to the points we talked about earlier, Jason, if they were framed well, would be a really strong way of both engaging maybe outsiders or people on the fringe of the praxis and pulling them into it, as well as helping to develop stronger technique within both the hobbyist level or the industry level. I do think schools are a way off, but I do think that they are one of the strongest ways of both preserving as well as propagating and moving forward, right? Progressing praxis. But I think they require at this point in time a lot of social, cultural capital, right? Economic as well. And I don't know who, what, where, right? The next really powerful schools of literati tradition, Chinese tea ceremony are going to come from. But I do think that a school will be the strongest way to really push forward a praxis.
Where do you think that this chapter will generate the most debate or contention within the tea world?
I would say it's on topics we've already touched on. I think, you made a choice when you left out existing tea schools, existing tea tests, tea competitions. I think leaving that out speaks as loudly as, talking about them as if you left them in. So I think that there will be people, right there, and there's well-respected figures and authorities, right, which support these programs. So, I think that will be a little bit contentious. I don't know if you have any more that you want to speak on it, Jason, but I think that's where I see contention.
For those that don't view, or maybe who have not read other parts of the book, and they're not thinking of this as a living ceremony and a living practice with practitioners that are evolving the practice, some people have a really strong reverence towards tradition and maybe even a backwards idea of what it means to be traditional. Think about propagation in terms of preserving tradition versus evolving the practice. One could say that the Japanese leans more heavy that way. But I think if you ask any random tea person on the internet, that they're going to be very focused on what is traditional. And, it's a fair way of viewing things when you're just beginning to learn, right? If I'm learning, Italian cooking techniques, the fundamentals, right? I want to know what's traditional. But I frame it that way because I don't have any better way of thinking about it.
No cream in your polenta?
So I'm not going to follow that up, but I really definitely agree with what you were putting out there, Ryan, because I think about my own tea journey and when I first started learning about Gongfu Cha, and we definitely, even at the Institute, right, we were going to other practitioners to try and learn from them, well-established practitioners. We would go to New York pretty frequently to visit some of the well-established tea shops in that area, to learn from the owners of those shops, to try and understand what they were doing differently than what we had learned at other shops or from other teachers, and trying to advance our technique. And a lot of that was based in tradition. And I think it really does take a long time, and maybe it's after you've reached the level of phenomenological practice that you start to look beyond tradition and see, how do I move this forward? How do I progress? Maybe everything that exists to make you a better brewer doesn't exist in the past. So how do I look forward and progress my practice in something that is rooted maybe in tradition but is new?
That's a great question for any practitioner. And it would have to be a question that was included in the rubric, right? What are you allowed to change? If someone shows up, starts roasting their green tea before brewing to, say, aliven it or reawaken it, is that something that's allowed? If we were to implement the competition, as I mentioned previously, said, everyone gets the same tea, right? And you can only brew this with some set of wares. So that it's really a test of practitioner skill. And then someone starts off by re-roasting that tea or awakening that tea over the hot plate or over the fire, right? Is that allowed? Is that not allowed? Is it within the scope of tradition, or is it, is it heterodox?
Yeah. Did you hand everyone stale tea and this one person made the right choice? It definitely, I'm looking forward to this theoretical competition becoming a reality. So you let everyone know listening at home, Jason, once you've created it.
I'll be the judge. You'll be the first reigning champion, and we'll see we'll see who else shows up and lays down some skill.
No nepotism involved.
I'm rooting for the next generation, Pat. I don't know what nepotism
we
you're
all are.
concerned about.
I'll be happy to lose to the next generation. I'll be happy. When I lose, it means that I get to learn something. So I'll be looking forward to it.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for a discussion of the next chapter, The Future of Chinese Tea Ceremony, Bottoms Up.